Good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Father Tim Talks. Today's presentation is kind of a follow-up from my last one about the Protestant Reformation, and this is what we call the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation, or the Catholic Reformation, most generally known as the Council of Trent. Council of Trent was established unity in the Catholic Church, or uniformity, in response to the various claims of the various reformers that had been circulating in the area of the Roman Empire. It kind of established uniformity in three major areas. First off, in beliefs or doctrine, dogma of the Catholic Church. To some extent in terms of morality or conduct for Catholics. And finally, the one that most everyone would have been acutely aware of would have been in liturgy or the Mass in worship. There was a long delay in calling the council. If you remember, Martin Luther proposed his 95 Theses in 1517, and it wasn't until 1545 that the council was called. There were a couple of reasons why I think there was a delay in calling this. First was kind of more of a political one. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, he initially tried to find some common ground between Protestants and Catholics in Germany, trying to reconcile both of them. So that took some time. Secondly, there was a lot of debate about where the council was to be held. King Francis I of France, who was a rival of the Germans, of course wanted it in France. He didn't want to go into the German territory. And of course, the Holy Roman Emperor wanted to have it in Germany. But they finally decided on Trent, which was close to Germany and easily accessible to France. There was also a fear of what we call conciliarism. And this would have been a movement that was present on some, was saying that the council, an ecumenical council of the church, would have a higher authority than what the Pope would have. And obviously this was kind of unsettling to popes, and it took them a while to kind of agree to have the council. Here you just see a little picture here of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, and then on the right is King Francis I of France. This just gives you an idea of the extent of the Holy Roman Empire. You'll see outlined in red is the boundary of the Holy Roman Empire. And then in color-coded here in green, this would have been the Holy Roman Empire, which would have been the Catholic government. And then in kind of the yellowish, that was kind of up in Germany, you see, that was the Lutheran government, you see where Lutheranism really set foot in. And then in kind of the light purple there, you'll see that those were mainly Calvinistic governments. And again, outlined there. So obviously the Roman Catholic Empire, Holy Roman Empire, was the largest, but significant acreage or hectares of land would have been the government of the Protestants, namely the Lutherans and the Calvinists. Where is Trent? Right there is Trent. You'll see it's in northern Italy, relatively close to Germany, and easily accessible to France would be right where that red arrow is. And here's just a little sort of a modern day picture of the city of Trento, Italy, or Trent, Italy, that you would see. Council opened then. Council opened on December 13th, 1545. You notice, about 30 years after Luther's proposed theses. Present at the council were 4 cardinals, 4 archbishops, 5 generals of religious orders, 3 abbots, head of religious orders, 35 theologians. And notice the Pope did not preside at the council. This was run by these individuals that were there, and the Holy Roman Empire Emperor and the King of France had some input into this. The other thing I think is significant to notice is that the theologians were the most, in the majority of those present at the council. And one of the legend, how true it is, we don't know, but there was a legend that in the middle of the assembly hall they placed a copy of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia to give kind of honor and get the idea of the sway and the significance that Thomas Aquinas had for the church, even though it had been like 300 years earlier that Thomas lived and wrote his Summa Theologia. It's just an artist's conception of what the council looked like. You could see the various abbots or head of religious orders seated up at the front there underneath the cardinals, and then the various theologians in the audience there, as well as some other people. Not very many people that were there. The process of the council then, how did it work? Well, first of all, the doctrines that were called into questions by the reformers were then read, and then there were suggestions or ideas that came forth about how we should respond to these, and then laws were enacted about the reforms. And yeah, it was kind of more laws than it was teaching. So how the process would work then is that theologians would first debate on the proposed decree that had come forth from theologians, perhaps some bishops writing this. And then the bishops assisted as an audience. Then, after they kind of came up with what the proposed decree, and after people had had their say, the bishops then would meet alone, and they then discussed the matter, making any additions or amendments to the proposed decree. And then finally, a public meeting was called, or a session. And then an open vote was taken, and the decree then was read as the council's definition, so that this was voted on by all those present at the council. It took a long time. As you see, the decree on justification took about 7 months to finally come up with. So what did Trent really do? First off, it offered us a very clearly defined set of beliefs for Catholics. By that, we could determine who's in and who's out. If you believe this, you were in. If you believe that, you were out. You were not Catholic. And it was almost a fortress mentality. You kind of see in the picture here, the fortress surrounded by walls, and those walls were kind of clearly established, metaphorically, by the council in saying, this is what we hold inside, and if you hold anything contrary to this, then you're outside of the walls. And that mentality kind of prevailed up until the Second Vatican Council. I want to look next a little bit at some of the Counter-Reformation popes. This is very select ones that are kind of my judgment here that were some of the significant ones. First off, Pope Paul IV, he reigned from 1555 to 1559. Paul IV was a very strong-willed pope who wanted to reform, but on his terms. Paul IV also begins what some of you may remember as the Index of Forbidden Books. These were books that Catholics would have been forbidden to read under pain of sin. It's interesting to note that this list of this index existed until 1966, so it was a long time. The Inquisition is strengthened under the reign of Paul IV. The Inquisition was begun by Pope Gregory IX around 1232 for the suppression of heresy. The Inquisition was notorious for in weeding out what they believed were heretics, and they used torture to try to get them to confess their sins and to turn their life around. It had was very much feared by people. This next picture here is an artist's conception of some of the torture that was used on these heretics. And you'll see several different methods here that they have that looked rather gruesome. And you'll see over to the left there, the priests and the members of the Inquisition who were kind of trying these heretics and trying to get them to repent of their errors. The next pope was Pope Pius V. He reigned from 1566 to 1572. Pius V was interesting in that he began what was called the Catechism of Trent. If you remember that Calvin had started a catechism for his believers, first kind of written down in terms of what the beliefs of Calvinism would be. The same was then done by the Catholics in this catechism of the Council of Trent. This was the standard in Catholicism up until the Second Vatican Council, which would have been the 1960s. Of course, there were additions made to this, but this was kind of the handbook or the catechism of what Catholics believed. Pius V also was trying to work at and continuing the reforms by emphasizing the spiritual nature of the reforms. As a result, he initiated the new missal that would have been used for the prayers of the Mass, that would have been all over for Catholics all over. He also kind of instigated a new breviary, or what we would call the office. This is the prayers that the priest and religious would say every day. And so in looking at that, he tried to emphasize, spirituality for the priests and religious to help continue these reforms of the Council of Trent. It wasn't just, he didn't see it purely as kind of the law as some did, but it was kind of an interior thing, the spirituality that would help usher in the reforms and keep them true to Christ's church. Pope Gregory VIII reigned from 1572 to 85. Most of the thing that we would know, a couple of things about Pope Gregory, is he's the one that gave us the Gregorian calendar. The calendar that they had used had not taken into account of what we commonly know as leap years, and so it was kind of out of sync. So what Pope Gregory did, interesting, he says, is that after midnight on October 4th, 1582, when we get up, it will be October 14th, 1582. So we gained 10 days there. And we currently are under the Gregorian calendar, and it was kind of to sync up the calendar with the passing of each year and the time it takes for the Earth to go around the sun. Gregory VIII was also founded the seminaries. Prior to this time, there was no kind of formal training ground for priests. They would kind of serve an apprentice under a priest, and then when the priest thought he was ready, he would present him to the bishop for ordination. But the seminaries were founded for the training of future priests, and obviously the catechism and the reforms of Trent would be taught in the seminaries. This gives you an idea here of the documents and the sessions of the Council of Trent. Now you'll see over to the right we have a decree. A decree is a defined belief or teaching of the council or of the church. And then a canon is kind of the law of the church, or that which is measured. And you'll notice that by an overwhelming majority, there were more canons that were passed by the council than there were decrees. They really kind of took a hard line and, clearly defining things. This was what we believe. If you don't, you're out. Okay? And you'll see the decree on justification, the third one down there, that was passed in session 6, and there were 33 canons that were issued from that session and 16 decrees. So obviously that was the burning issue that the council faced. You'll see some of the other ones, and the high numbers of canons there. About midway down, the Sacrament of Penance had 15 canons and 15 decrees. Again, this would have been about some of the behavior, and again, a way of exercising this is in, this is out. If you go out, you need to go to receive penance. Marriage also, down towards the bottom there, had 12 canons and only 1 decree. But you'll see, by and large, most of the information, the ideas that came out, were in the forms of canons and very few decrees. This, for example, is the wording of a canon, and this was Canon 9. Quote, "If anyone says that the sinner is justified by faith alone, meaning that nothing else is required to cooperate in order to obtain the grace of justification, and that it is not in any way necessary that he be prepared and disposed by the action of his own will, let him be anathema. Anathema means cut off. So this would have been, in our understanding, excommunicated. So if you didn't believe this, then you would be excommunicated. And this is the power then that these canons held over people. And like you see, in the previous slide, you'll see how many canons were there, and then most of them would have been excommunicated if people believed in those. What the Catholics and the Council of Trent then did is we're looking at the pillars of the faith. And they came up, as we know, of two pillars of our faith, that our faith is based on, both the scriptures and tradition. Those are the supports for the Catholic faith. In part, this was done against the Luther and the Reformers, saying that it is not just sola scriptura, or only the scriptures. Catholic faith is based on the scriptures and tradition. So it was also, the tradition would have been like the writings of the church fathers, theologians, bishops, popes, and so on, that all these were included and could be a part, in some cases, of the Catholic faith if they were declared so by the councils. Justification. Let's look a little bit at that, since that was a major emphasis at the Council of Trent, and also one of Luther's major kind of complaints or gripes about the church. Luther maintained that human nature is tainted, and it's tainted to the core, and it's only through faith that humans are justified. Sola fides, in the words of Luther. Not through works, which would have been like the indulgences or prayers. Luther maintained that it was only through faith in God. Because if Luther maintained that if it was through works, that this would be human effort and not God's. And that God justifies humanity with his infinite goodness. So Luther maintained it was all on God through faith, and that's how we were justified or made right with God. For the Catholics in Trent, they said that Christ continually infuses his virtue into the said justified as the head to the members and the vine into the branches. This virtue always precedes, accompanies, and follows their good works. So obviously Christ and God are a part of this, but it kind of flows into them that accompanies and follows, he says, their good works. It's through virtue, through grace, through God's work that we are able to do these good works. God accompanies us on our way through prayer, the good works, and then it follows us. So you can see, the difference there between how Trent responded to Luther's claims about justification. So the Catholics maintain and still maintain that we are justified through faith and works. So this is against the Protestant claims that we are justified sola fide, only through faith. For Catholics, it's the good works that accompany faith. So we see, the prayer that we have, and then that it's lived out in good works. It leads to good works. And that, I think, is helpful for us to recall even today, that we look at, our prayer leading into good works. Trent also came out against the selling of indulgences. If you remember the claims of Johann Tetzel, and this practice was condemned by the council. You see Johann Tetzel there with his box, and people are putting the coins in there. And if you remember from the last one where he said, the legend was, when the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Well, Trent put a big no on that. And they said, that is not what we believe. Claims about the priesthood. Remember, the Protestant Reformers talked about the common priesthood of all believers by virtue of baptism. And again, prior to Trent, there really was not any real education for clergy. As I mentioned before, there was kind of like an apprenticeship. So the clergy, in a lot of ways, were not really educated, and so didn't know how to respond to and address the claims that were made by the reformers. In the priesthood, what Trent does is it argues against the claims of the Reformers that there's only one priesthood, that is the priesthood of Christ. It affirms two types of priesthood. One of those is what they call the internal priesthood or the priesthood of the baptized. And that's, again, something that we still maintain. At baptism, when the baby is anointed with chrism oil, the priest says, you are anointed as Christ was anointed priest, prophet, and king, so may you live always as a member of his body. So all the baptized share in the priesthood of Christ in an internal way. Trent affirms, though, that there is an external priesthood. They say that those certain men ordained and consecrated to God by the lawful imposition of hands. And so it affirms the validity of the priesthood that they trace back to Christ himself. Reform of the clergy. As I mentioned, in large part, the clergy were largely uneducated. But so looking at the clergy, there were a lot of bishops that were kind of absentee landlords, if you would put it. Trent declared that the bishops had to live in their diocese. They could not live elsewhere. They had to be in their diocese. It also instituted clerical celibacy. That priests could not be married. And this was due in large part to some of the monastic influence. Clerical celibacy started in the church around the year 1000, and then it was kind of mandated by the Council of Trent. Each diocese had to begin a seminary. And in the words in the Council of Catechism of Trent, it says that boys, preferably poor boys, would receive training for service. The college, the collegium, would be a permanently fruitful seedbed from the Latin seminarium of ministers of God. So this is where boys would become educated and receive training for the priesthood. And some of you may know some of the seminaries for missionaries of the precious blood. Over to the left there is Brunnerdale Seminary. That was our minor seminary or high school seminary located in Canton, Ohio. That was closed in about 1981-82. And then over to the right, one that all around here in our cluster would probably know, is St. Charles Seminary, or St. Charles Center as it's known now. This would have been our major seminary, or where our men did the last couple of years of college, and then mainly in the later years, their graduate theological studies. The St. Charles as a seminary was closed in 1969. But these were some of the seminaries for the missionaries of the precious blood. The Mass. Trent affirmed that Mass is a sacrifice. Quote, the one and same sacrifice as that of the cross. They say, the victim is the same. It is Christ. The bloody sacrifice of Calvary and the unbloody sacrifice of the Mass are one in the same. And that the work of salvation continues through the Mass. So really emphasizing, making that connection between the sacrifice, the bloody sacrifice of Calvary is the same as the unbloody sacrifice of the Mass. And you can see these are some holy cards kind of that were very prominent in the 1950s. And you'll see that how they emphasized in art in these holy cards that people would take that connection between the Mass and the sacrifice on Calvary. On the left, you see the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The priest there facing the crucifix with Christ crucified. And then all around that mystical body of Christ that was gathered that joins in at each and every Mass. The picture on the right there, you'll see the side of Christ bleeding into the chalice, again, to emphasize that the bloody sacrifice of Christ on the cross at Calvary is the same as the one that's offered at the Mass. And these would have been helps and guides for people to kind of help to make that connection each time they were at Mass. And the sacraments. Sacraments, as we know, were signs instituted by Christ to give grace. In the Council Catechism of the Council of Trent, they declared that there are 7 sacraments, not 2, as many of the Protestant traditions did. And they claimed that these are necessary for salvation. The Eucharist, they maintained again, working on that Christ is really present in the Eucharist or in communion. It is really Christ. It's not a symbol, it's not a memorial, that Christ is really present in the Eucharist that we receive. Conclusions. Well, did the Council of Trent work? Well, it certainly did. It clarified and reaffirmed the Catholic faith in responding to the claims of the Protestant Reformers. It brought unity throughout the Catholic Church, which was mainly focused in Europe, as we saw. It provided clear answers to theological and moral dilemmas. It was very clear, as we'll see, as you saw in one of the canons there, that it was, if you don't believe this, you're anathema. And I think it also did provide a process for reform and to educate the clergy, both in terms of the seminaries and in terms of the prayers used at Mass in the new edition of the Missal and through the breviary that priests say. So it kind of worked from without in the laws and within the spirituality of the clergy and religious. Trent's reforms, as we know, would last until the 1960s when Pope John the 23rd called the Council of Trent. A question that I ask, as I had mentioned, above, that the Catholic Church, the Universal Church, was mainly focused in Central Europe, in France as well. But a question that I raise, would it work for a world church today, as we've got, Catholicism all over the globe, various different cultures? Trent was in the cultures, would have been a relatively homogenous culture, although some differences there that we see, among different countries. But if we look at today, I don't know. It's a question. But I think, we've got to have something that works for a world church today, and that's the challenge that we have. I hope you enjoyed this little presentation, and I hope you tune in for the next edition of the Father Tim Talks. And thank you for being here and joining with me today.